Holodomor can be literally translated to death by hunger. It's a horrifying fate that between 7 and 10 million people suffered in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, thanks to the Soviet Union's harsh grain quotas and Joseph Stalin's underlying desire to totally subdue the Ukrainian population. In recent years, with further evaluation of Joseph Stalin's methods in Ukraine that led to this mass famine, historians have been forced to reconsider and reassess what happened between 1932 and 1933, with many now renaming the Holodomor as nothing shorter than genocide. Before joining the Soviet Union in 1922, Ukraine was its own independent, thriving nation. This was in no small part due to their flourishing agriculture, with lands full of fertile soil ripe for farming. The crops produced in Ukraine became so well known that after joining, it became known as the Soviet Union's breadbasket. Joseph Stalin, head of the new Soviet Union, wanted to ensure he had a Ukraine under his complete control, and so he introduced a 5-year plan in 1928, part of which included what was called the collectivization of agriculture that was meant to meet the needs of the rapidly expanding urban population. Using this method, all individual peasant farms would be replaced by collective ones, effectively destroying the class of kulak, peasant farmers with greater land or property, and replacing individual farms with large state-run ones instead that Stalin could more easily control. Stalin also increased his grain quota year on year to unsustainable figures, much to the dismay of the peasant farmers. Stalin's methods were unpopular, and many peasant farmers revolted against collectivization, particularly in the class of the kulaks. What started as peaceful protests became violent as the farmers went so far as to even kill their own animals and burn their crops in response to Stalin's measures. In response, Stalin seized the opportunity to completely remove himself of the kulak peasant class, and so he exiled, imprisoned, and executed hundreds of thousands to millions and cut off rations. Kulaks were sent to exile settlements in Kazakhstan and Siberia, where many died along the way. Some were sent to forced labor camps. Those who didn't meet their grain quotas were fined 5 times more and had their property confiscated shortly thereafter. By spring 1932, Ukraine simply could not keep up with demand. As a whole, the country produced 4.3 million tons of grain, a big shortfall from the previous year's 7.2 million tons. With the removal of the kulaks, increased grain quotas, and rampant state-sanctioned murder of the Ukrainian people, the harvest that year was unsurprisingly poor. In urban areas, rations were cut further and further. Cutting off aid, workers may send their family in the countryside, till eventually they could barely feed themselves. As conditions worsened in city centers, the Soviet government began to effectively cut off travel and information links from the city to the country. They could not as easily hide the truth of what was happening in urban areas as rural, though. Ukraine was starving. The 2 worst affected areas were Kiev and Vinnytsia, but Stalin and the government blamed the famine on the peasants, turning citizens against each other. In towns, they told workers that the farmers were deliberately withholding grain whilst they starved, with thousands dying daily across the country. Some historians argue this is precisely what Stalin wanted, a weakened or even completely wiped out Ukraine. As time went on and the crisis worsened, he employed harsher and harsher restrictions on the country under false pretenses that only added to the pain of the famine he had created. In December 1932, the government introduced an internal passport system that prevented peasants from leaving the countryside entirely, with Stalin claiming it was to prevent people leaving the country for nefarious anti-Soviet reasons. If they did try to escape, they could find themselves fined, put in labor camps, arrested, or even executed. People died in the streets and in their fields. Survivors tell stories of bloated, dead bodies and a desperation for food that meant many had to resort to methods they never would have dreamed of to survive. One of the most prominent of these was cannibalism. When food became completely unobtainable and people could see nowhere else to turn to survive, many resorted to cannibalism, eating the corpses of their fellow starved. It became such a fact of life during this desperate year that posters were printed in an attempt to discourage it. As one woman wrote to her friend in June 1933, "The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did. Continued raids of farms by the government stole what little grain remained, and day by day, more died. The Soviet government and Stalin repeatedly tried to hide the truth of what was occurring in Ukraine and indeed across other areas of the Soviet Union as caused by Stalin's policies. They threatened reporters and denied entry to the country, and in the Soviet Union, any mention or discussion of the famine was banned entirely. It is only thanks to a few reporters that we have the knowledge we have on just how many people suffered under Stalin's attempt to obtain total control. One such individual was Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist who traveled to the Soviet Union for a third time in 1933, after previously writing anonymous articles in 1930 and 1931 on the country. His piece in 1931 in particular incited the Soviet Union's anger, as it was about the then burgeoning Ukraine famine. In 1933, when he returned, Gareth Jones successfully sneaked his way into Ukraine. He kept diaries of what he witnessed, and when he returned to the UK, his press release was met by disbelief and horror. Everywhere was the cry, "There is no bread, we are dying." In the train, a communist denied to me that there was a famine. "We are waiting for death," was my welcome. "But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south, there they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people and already dead." 2 years later, in 1935, Gareth Jones was murdered on assignment in China and Japan. Although unconfirmed, it has long been suspected that his murderers were the NKVD, the old KGB of the Soviet Union. Whether Stalin foresaw or planned the mass murder of approximately 7 to 11 million people is up for debate, but he certainly went into Ukraine with one intention: to beat or starve it into submission.